They said the age of resistance had ended, that the world had been tamed by agreements and debts, that leadership was now measured not by courage, but by compliance. Yet from the heart of Africa rose a voice that refused silence. A young soldier turned statesman who spoke not merely for his own people, but for an entire generation, yearning to stand upright before the world. His name became a whisper first, then an echo, and finally a thunderclap across continents: Ibrahim Traore. To understand the weight of this moment, one must first grasp what he represents. For decades, Africa's political horizon seemed bound by invisible chains, contracts written in foreign languages, budgets dictated from distant capitals, and resources extracted under the polite guise of partnership. The world expected obedience. The world received awakening. When Traoré stepped onto the stage of power, he did not arrive as a polished diplomat. He arrived as a reminder that leadership was never meant to be a costume of comfort, but a crucible of conviction. His speeches were not softened by the vocabulary of caution. They were carved in the language of truth, and that truth unsettled those who had long defined Africa's place in the global order. He spoke of dignity, of sovereignty, of the right of a people to decide their own destiny. To some ears, this sounded dangerous, not because it threatened peace, but because it threatened control. Every time he took the microphone, he disrupted the quiet choreography of submission that had governed so much of Africa's modern history. In boardrooms and embassies, thousands of miles away, analysts began to watch closely. They did not fear a man with weapons. They feared a man with ideas, because ideas, once spoken, cannot be unspoken. In a world where wealth and influence are concentrated in a few hands, the emergence of an unyielding voice from Africa challenged an architecture of power that had grown accustomed to silence. Traoré's message was clear. The age of dictation from abroad was over, and the age of African agency had begun. The courage to say these words was not born in comfort. It came from generations of struggle, from the memory of independence movements that had been celebrated but never fully realized. Many African leaders before him had spoken of reform. Few had dared to confront its obstacles so directly. Where others negotiated, Traoré demanded. Where others pleaded for fairness, he proclaimed self-reliance. He understood that the continent's greatest battle was not against foreign armies, but against dependence itself. Dependency had been wrapped in the language of aid, but its substance was control of budgets, of priorities, of dreams. And so, when he declared that Africa must stand on its own feet, the world listened not with admiration, but with apprehension. There is a peculiar tension in the way global power responds to independence. When a small nation seeks autonomy, it is praised as noble. When a continent of 54 nations seeks the same, it is treated as rebellion. Yet the tide of history does not consult comfort. It moves according to the courage of those willing to act. Traoré's call resonated because it echoed an ancient longing that Africa would no longer be a story told by others, but a storyteller in its own right. From universities to marketplaces, from villages to parliaments, the idea spread. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a practice. It means producing what we consume, deciding what we value, and protecting what we own. In those early months of his leadership, the changes were not merely administrative. They were psychological. People began to believe again that politics could be sacred work, that the continent's destiny was not predetermined by external expectation. A new pride emerged, fierce yet disciplined, patriotic yet visionary. Of course, such conviction invites opposition. Every movement that seeks to awaken the oppressed will face the anxiety of those who benefit from their sleep. Economic pressures tightened, narratives were distorted, and threats whispered through diplomatic channels. Yet each attempt to silence him only amplified the message that Africa was entering a season of awakening, and that no amount of external disapproval could extinguish the will to stand upright. He spoke often of courage as a contagion. When one nation dared to defy unjust structures, others would follow. And indeed, the language of unity began to travel, from the Sahel to the Great Lakes, from West Africa's savannas to the coasts of the East. The idea of self-determination was no longer theoretical. It was viral. What made this moment so consequential was not only the content of his speeches, but their timing. The world is in transition, economic systems strained, alliances questioned, populations restless. Amid that uncertainty, Africa's voice became not an echo of others, but an origin of thought. Traoré framed the issue plainly. If global order is truly just, it must allow every region to shape its destiny without coercion. If partnership is genuine, it must be built on equality, not hierarchy. His critics called it defiance. His supporters called it restoration. Behind the rhetoric was a moral argument that the worth of a nation should not be measured by its obedience to powerful friends, but by its service to its people. In a century that worships markets, he reminded the world of morality. In an era of data and dollars, he spoke of dignity and destiny. It was this moral tone that unsettled his detractors the most. For systems built on convenience cannot withstand the scrutiny of conscience. He did not speak in anger, but in principle. He asked simple questions that pierce through the complexities of geopolitics. Why should a continent so rich in resources remain poor in opportunity? Why should those who extract its wealth lecture it on governance? Why must prosperity elsewhere depend on poverty here? Questions, when asked with integrity, are revolutionary. As he continued to speak, international commentary shifted. Some tried to paint him as a populist, others as a dreamer. Yet beyond labels stood the undeniable truth that his leadership had ignited something larger than himself. He began to articulate a vision not just for his own country, but for an entire continent, a federation of strength guided by shared principles of justice, sustainability, and mutual respect. It was not about isolation, but about parity. He did not reject the world. He demanded that the world recognize Africa as an equal. This vision stirred both admiration and unease. For centuries, Africa had been cast as a receiver of aid, of instruction, of permission. To hear it now, speaking as an author of history, was for many disorienting. Yet history has never advanced without discomfort. Every age of renewal begins as heresy to the old order. The deeper meaning of Traoré's message lay not in policy, but in posture. It was a spiritual realignment. To stand after generations of being told to kneel is a sacred act. And once a people learn to stand, they will never again accept to crawl. In this sense, what the world saw as confrontation was, in fact, a declaration of self-respect. It was Africa saying, "We are not your shadow. We are your mirror." From this foundation grew new conversations about African currencies, defense alliances, educational reforms, and digital independence. Each discussion carried the same heartbeat. Freedom must be structural, not symbolic. The young looked at Traoré and saw a possibility that patriotism could coexist with modernity, that sovereignty could thrive without hostility. The elders, too, recognized in him a continuity with their unfinished struggles. And across the diaspora, the name became a banner of belonging. But as his influence expanded, so did the scrutiny. Media outlets from across the world sought to interpret his motives, often through the lens of their own interests. Some saw in him a potential disruptor of international norms, others a necessary corrective to them. Whatever the analysis, none could deny that his presence had altered the conversation about Africa's place in the world. He was not the first to speak of liberation, but perhaps the first of his generation to speak with such unapologetic clarity. The old vocabulary of dependency, aid, assistance, adjustment, was replaced by the language of equality, partnership, and pride. It is said that history remembers those who remind it of its conscience. Traoré's rise came not from privilege, but from purpose. He represented a generation unwilling to inherit humiliation as destiny. And in that refusal, a new chapter began. They said that a single voice could not change the course of continents. Yet as his message traveled from dusty towns to marble halls, it began to gather a momentum no power could contain. What started as the speech of one man evolved into a symphony of millions, students, workers, soldiers, Elders, all united by a single conviction that Africa must not ask for permission to exist in dignity. In the weeks that followed his declarations, a new rhythm seemed to pulse across the continent. Farmers spoke of sovereignty over their land, engineers of building industries that served their people, scholars of rewriting textbooks to include the brilliance of African minds, long forgotten by foreign curriculums. This was not rebellion, it was rebirth. At international summits, Traoré's words echoed with a calm defiance that unsettled even seasoned diplomats. "We do not seek conflict," he would say, "but neither do we seek approval." To him, the most dangerous dependency was not economic, it was psychological. It was the internalized belief that Africa must always measure its worth through the lens of others. He challenged that illusion with an unshakable confidence. "Our nations are not experiments," he declared once. "We are civilizations. We are the cradle of humanity. And the cradle has awakened." It was this awakening that rippled through young Africans everywhere. They began to speak of a future that did not require escape to foreign shores, but investment in their own. Universities saw the rise of new movements demanding curricula rooted in African realities. Artists, poets, and filmmakers took his speeches as inspiration, turning them into music, murals, and manifestos. It was as if an entire generation had been waiting for permission to dream in their own language. The world watched closely. Economists, pundits, and strategists dissected every statement, some predicting collapse, others heralding transformation. But what none could quantify was the emotional power of pride. Once people rediscover their worth, no charter model can measure their potential. Traoré often said that dignity is not a luxury, it is oxygen. Without it, nations suffocate no matter how much aid they receive. With it, they can survive storms that would destroy empires. That belief guided every decision he made. Where others saw diplomacy as submission, he treated it as negotiation among equals. He welcomed dialogue but rejected dictation. "We will not isolate ourselves," he said, "but neither will we be absorbed." His vision for Africa was not one of separation from the world, but of true participation within it. He imagined trade built on reciprocity, alliances rooted in respect, and technology shared without exploitation. In his view, globalization was not the problem, inequality was. That message resonated not only within Africa, but across the global South. Leaders from Asia and Latin America began quoting his speeches. Activists in Europe cited his words in debates about justice and decolonization. A sense of alignment began to form among nations long treated as peripheral, a sense that history was offering them a chance to redefine the center. Of course, such clarity of purpose always attracts opposition. Attempts were made to isolate his government diplomatically, to restrict access to credit, to paint his leadership as reckless. But those measures failed to weaken his legitimacy at home. If anything, they strengthened it. Each challenge reinforced his narrative that true independence is costly but priceless. He would tell his people, "When the price of freedom frightens you, remember the cost of servitude." In the months that followed, new alliances emerged. African nations began to discuss regional defense, shared currencies, and continental development banks. None of these ideas were new, but under Traoré's voice they gained urgency. He reminded the continent that no empire lasts forever, but nations that stand together can endure. He did not present unity as a dream, but as a strategy. "The world respects strength," he said, "and strength begins with solidarity." In those words lay a lesson both moral and practical. Unity was not only a shield, it was an engine. Divided Africa was a collection of markets. United, it was a civilization, with the power to shape global destiny. It was at a major international gathering broadcast live to the world that he delivered the speech that would be remembered as his most defining moment. The hall was filled with presidents, ministers, and representatives of every major power. The atmosphere was polite but tense. He stepped to the podium not as a supplicant, but as an equal. He began with calm simplicity. For centuries, Africa has been the mirror in which the world sees what it wants to see, a continent of resources, of problems, of potential. but today we break the mirror and let the world see our face." Then, with deliberate pacing, he listed the truths long ignored, that the continent's minerals powered foreign industries, its youth staffed foreign armies, its soil fed foreign markets, while its people were told to wait for development. "We will wait no more," he said. His words did not rise in anger, but in purpose. "This is not a declaration of hostility," he continued, "but a declaration of adulthood. Africa has grown up. We do not hate our partners. We invite them to treat us as equals." The applause came hesitantly at first, then grew into something thunderous. For many in that hall, it was not only the speech of a leader, it was the confession of a world order that had too long denied balance. In the days after that address, commentators struggled to frame the moment. Some called it audacious, others visionary, but among ordinary Africans it was described with a single word: necessary, because at its core, his message was not about confrontation but correction. The old systems of exploitation had been built on the assumption that Africa would never speak with one voice. Traore proved that assumption wrong. He became a symbol not of aggression, but of integrity, a leader unafraid to say that partnership cannot exist between the powerful and the powerless. It must exist between equals, or not at all. This moral clarity is what drew admiration from many and unease from others. In a world accustomed to diplomacy as theater, his authenticity was disarming. There was no hidden agenda, no double language, only conviction, spoken with the stillness of certainty. But what made him truly transformative was his insistence that this awakening must not depend on him alone. "Leaders will come and go," he said, "but nations must remain awake." He encouraged education not as obedience to systems, but as a weapon of liberation. He spoke of engineers as builders of sovereignty, of teachers as architects of destiny, of farmers as guardians of freedom. He described each profession as a sacred duty to the nation, and, slowly, his philosophy evolved into a continental creed that dignity is the highest currency, and unity the most powerful weapon. This creed began shaping policy discussions, regional meetings, even youth movements. People no longer asked if Africa could rise. They asked when, and increasingly, the answer was now. As his influence expanded beyond the continent, a curious transformation took place abroad as well. Those who had once viewed Africa as a place of pity began to see it as a place of possibility. Universities started new programs in African governance and innovation. Global media began to feature African thinkers not as guests, but as equals. A subtle rebalancing had begun, not imposed, but inspired. In this sense, Traore's legacy was not limited to politics. It was psychological, philosophical, spiritual. He had shifted how the world imagined Africa and how Africa imagined itself. But with every revolution of dignity comes resistance. Economic powers tried to frame his reforms as destabilizing. Certain alliances grew tense, yet he remained composed. "When the world resists your awakening," he said, "it is proof that you have awakened." And through every storm, he returned to the same truth, that leadership is not domination, but direction. Not command, but conviction. His closing address at a global summit encapsulated his entire mission. The hall was silent as he spoke these final words. "We have been told that order must be maintained. But what order preserves inequality is not order, it is oppression. We have been told to be patient, as if freedom were a favor. But freedom is not given. It is claimed. We say to the world, we will not turn our back on cooperation, but we will no longer bow our heads in submission. Our soil will feed our children first. Our gold will build our schools. Our oil will light our homes. Our minds will guide our policies. We extend our hands to every nation, willing to walk beside us, not ahead of us, not behind us, but beside us. For this is the century of balance, and Africa will be its conscience." The hall erupted in applause. Some clapped out of admiration, others out of recognition that a new chapter of history had been written before their eyes. When the broadcast ended, analysts debated the political implications. But among the people watching from homes and cafes across Africa, there was no debate, only pride, because they understood that in that moment, Traore had not spoken for himself. He had spoken for them, and that is why his name endures, not as a symbol of fear, but of faith, not as a threat, but as a testament. He reminded the world that power without justice is fragility, and justice without courage is fantasy. And so long as his words echo across the continent, Africa will remember that no chain, no sanction, no headline can silence a people who have remembered their worth, for history, once awakened, does not sleep again.